Some of you may have heard that Disney cooperation and responsibility for the least one live ghost town. Disney built the Treasure Island Resort in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas. It didn't start as a ghost town. Disney's cruise ships would actually stop at the resort and leave tourists there to relax in luxury. This is a fact. Look it up. Disney blew $30 million on this place. Yes, $30 million. Then they just abandoned it. Disney blamed the shallow waters, too shallow for their ships for safe cooperation, and there was even blame cast on the workers, saying that since they were from the Bahamas, they were too lazy to work a regular schedule. That's where the factual nature of their story ends. It wasn't because of the sand, and it obviously wasn't because the foreigners are lazy. Both are convenient excuses. No, I sincerely doubt these reasons were legitimate. Why don't I buy these official stories? Because of Mongo's Palace. Near the beachside city on Embro Isle of North Carolina, Disney began construction of Mongo's Palace. In the late 1990s, the concept was a jungle-themed resort with a large, you guessed it, palace in the center of the whole thing. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Malagai, then you might better remember the story The Jungle Book. If you hadn't seen it anywhere else, you know it as a Disney cartoon just decades past. Mongo is an abandoned child in the jungle, essentially raised by animals and simultaneously threatened and persuaded by other animals. Mongo's Palace was a controversial undertaking from the start. Disney bought up a ton of high-priced land from the project, and there was actually a scandal surrounding some of the purchases. The local government claimed eminent domain on people's homes, then turned around and sold the properties to Disney. At one point, a home that had been constructed was immediately demolished and with little to no explanation. The land grabbed by the government was supposedly by some fictional highway project. Knowing full well that what was going on, people started calling it Mickey Mouse Highway. Then there was the concept art. A group of stuffed shirts with Disney Company actually had a city meeting. They intended to sell everyone on how lucrative this project was going to be for everyone. Then they showed the concept art, this gigantic Indian palace surrounded by jungle, staffed with men and women in loincloth and graybill gear, well sufficient to say suffice to everyone flip their shit. We're talking about a large Indian palace, jungle and loincloths not only in the center of Lake Tivity Wealth area, but also a somewhat xenophobic area of the northern USA. It was a questionable mix at the point in history. One member of the crowd tried to storm the stage, but he was quickly subdued by security after he managed to break one of the presentation boards over his knee. Disney took that community and essentially broke it over its knee as well. The houses were razed and land was cleared, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do or say about it. Local TV and newspapers were against the report at the beginning, but some insane connection between Disney's media holding and the local venues came into play, and their options turned on a dime. So anyway, Treasure Island, the Bahamas, Disney sunk these millions in and then split. The same thing happened with Miguel's Palace. Construction was complete. Visitors actually stayed at the resort. The surrounding communities were flooded with traffic and the usual announces associated with an influence of lost and erased tourists. Then it just all stopped. Disney shut it down, and nobody knew what the hell to think. But they were pretty happy about it. Disney's loss was pretty hilarious, and found it wonderful to a large group of folk who didn't want this in the first place. Honestly, didn't give the place another thought since hearing it closed over a decade ago. I lived around 4 hours from Emerald Isle, so really, I only heard the rumbling and didn't experience any of it firsthand. Then I read the article from someone who had explored the Treasure Island Resort and posted a whole blog about this crazy shit he found there. Stuff just left behind. Things smashed, defaced, probably ruined by the disgruntled former employees who had lost their jobs. Hell, the locals from all around probably had a hand in wrecking that place. People there felt just as angry about Treasure Island as folks here did about Mongo's Palace. Plus, there were rumors that Disney had released their aquarium stock into the local waters they closed, including sharks. Who would want to take a few swings at some merchandise after that? Well, what I'm getting at is that this blog about Treasure Island got me thinking. Even though many years have passed since this closing, I figured it might be cool to do some urban exploration at Mongo's Palace. Take some photos, write about my experience, and probably see if there is anything I could take home as a momentum. I'm not going to say I wasted no time in getting there because honestly, it took me some time, or as I should say, another year after I first found the Treasure Island article to get around to going up to Emerald Isle. Over the course of a year, I did a lot of research on the Palace Resort, or rather, I tried to. Naturally, no official Disney site or resource made any mention of the place that had been scrubbed clean. Even odder, however, was that no one before myself had apparently thought to blog about the place, or even post a photo. None of the local TV or newspaper sites had one word about the place, though it was to be expected since they all had swung Disney's way. They wouldn't make out to launder their embarrassment, you know. Recently, I learned that corporations actually asked Disney, for example, to remove links from research results. Basically, no good reason. Looking back, I probably not that nobody spoke of the resort, but rather their words were made inaccessible. So in the end, I could barely find the place. All I had to go on was an old-as-hell map I'd received in the mail back in the 90s. I made a promotional item set out to the people who had recently been to Disney World, and I guess since I had been there in the late 80s, that was recent. I did not really intend to hang on to it. It just got shoved in with my books and comics from my childhood. I'd only remember it months into my research, and even then it took me another few weeks to locate this storage bin my parents had shoved it all into. But I did find it. Locals were no help, and most were transplants who had moved to the beaches in recent years, or old residents who just sneered at me and made rude gestures the second I managed to say, "Where would I find Mongols?" The drive took me through an inordinary long corridor of overgrown tropical plants that had run rampant and overpopulated the area, mixed with native plants and floral that actually belonged there and had tried to reclaim the land. I was in awe when I reached the front gates of the resort, tremendous moth-thick wooden gates whose supports had either side looked like they had been cut from giant sequoias. The gate itself seemed to gouged in several places by woodpeckers and eaten away by the base by burrowing insects. Hanging on the gates was a sheet of metal, some random scrap, with hand-painted letters scrawled in black, "Abandoned by Disney." Clearly the handiwork of some past local, or an employee who wanted to make a small protest. The gates were open enough to walk through, but not to drive. So grabbing my digital camera and the map whose flip side showed a layout of the resort, I set off on foot. The inner grounds of the palace were just as overgrown as the entryway. Palm trees stood unattended and ragged among piles of their own coconuts. Banana plants similar stood there in their own stinking bud-riddled refuse. There was this sort of clash between order and chaos, as carefully planted rows of Panero flowers mixed with obnoxiously tall weeds and stinking blackened mushrooms. All that remained of an outdoor structure were broken, rotten wood and various shards, bits of unidentified metal. What was most likely an information booth or an outdoor bar was simply a pile of assorted debris chopped up by the past vandalism and ravaged by weather. The most interesting thing on the ground was a statue of Babaloo, the friendly bear from the Jungle Book, which stood in a sort of courtyard in front of the main building. He was frozen in a jovial way towards no one, staring into empty space with a silly, toothy grin as bird shit covered his whole swaths of his fur, and vines ensnared the platform. I approached the main building, the palace, only to find outside the building covered in graffiti where the original paint hadn't peeled and chipped away. The front doors weren't just open, they had been taken off their hinges and were stolen. Above the front doors, or the gaping maw where they had been, someone had once painted again, "Abandoned by Disney." I wish I could tell you about the awesome stuff I saw inside the palace. For forgotten statues, abandoned cash registers, a full-fledged secret society of homeless bums. But no, the inside of the building was so stark, so bare, that I actually think people had stolen molding off the walls. Anything that was too big to seal, counters, desks, fake giant trees. They were all resting amid their empty echo chamber, which amplified every step like a slow rat-a-tat of a machine gun. I checked the floor painting and headed to all locations that might seem in any way interesting. The kitchen was as you imagine, an industrial food prep with all the appliances of space, no expenses spared. Every glass surface was broken, every door knocked off its hinges, every metal surface kicked and dented. The entire place smelled like very old piss. The huge freezer was not remotely cool now. It had row upon row of empty space. Hooks hung from the ceiling, probably from hanging cuts of meat, and as I stood inside for a moment, I noticed they were swinging. Each hook swung in a random direction, but their movements were so slow and small that it was almost impossible to see. I figured it had been caused by my footstep, so I stopped one of them from swinging by clutching it in my fist, then carefully letting it go. But within seconds, it started to swing once more. The bathrooms were in much the same state as the rest of the place. Just like the Treasure Island resort, someone had methodically smashed each porcelain commode with coconuts and other implements. There was about half an inch of rancid water, stinking staggered water on the floor, so I didn't stay there very long. What's odd is that the toilets and sinks in the bidgets in the ladies' room, yes, I went there, all dripped, linked, or ran freely. It seemed to me that they should have shut the water off long ago. There were plenty of rooms in a resort, but naturally, I didn't have time to look through them. The few I did peer into were suddenly wrecked, and I didn't expect to find anything there. I thought it was actually a television or radio in one room. I really think I heard a quiet conversation coming out, though it was like a whisper, probably my own breathing echoing in the silence, or just another case of the sound of flowing water playing tricks on my mind. This is what it sounded like.
I don't believe it. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Your father told you.
I know. That sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you what I experienced. Why I thought there might have been something running in that room, or worse, some vagrants that had been held up here and probably would have knifed me. At the front doors of the palace again, I figured I hadn't found anything of note and had wasted a trip up. As I looked out the door, I noticed something interesting in the courtyard that I apparently missed, something that would give me at least one thing to show for all of my trouble, even if it was just a photograph. There is a lifelike statue of a python, maybe an 80-foot-long, coiled up, sunning itself on a pedestal right in the center of the area. It was almost time for the sun to start setting, so the light fell on the object in a perfect way for a photograph. I approached the python and stared at the photo. Then I stood on my toes and snapped another. I moved closer again to get a detail of its face. Slowly, casually, the python lifted its head, looked directly into my eyes, turned and slithered off the pedestal across the glass and into the trees. All 80 feet of it, its head long disappeared into the woods before its tail even left the sunny spot. Disney had released all their exotic animals onto the grounds. Right there on my floor plan map was the reptile house. I should have known. I read about the sharks at the Treasure Isle, and I should have known they'd done this. I was dumbfounded, just utterly stupefied. My mouth must have been hanging open for the longest time before I came back down to earth, and snapped it shut. I blinked a few times and backed away from where the snake had been, back toward the palace. Even though it was totally gone, I still hadn't taken my chance and backed away into the building. It took a few deep breaths and slapped to my own face to get myself right in the head again after that. I looked for a place to sit down, as my legs were feeling a bit like jelly at this point. Of course, there was no place to sit down unless I wanted to recline in broken glass and dead leaf carpet, or haul myself up onto a desk of questionable ability. I had seen some stairs near the palace's lobby and decided to go have a seat there until I felt better. The staircase was far enough away from the front of the building to be relatively clean, safe from a startling accumulation of dust. I pulled a wedge of metal off the wall, once again painted with the words "Abandoned by Disney" motto I'd become accustomed to. I placed the wedge of the stairs and sat on it to keep myself at least somewhat clean. The stairway led downward, but below the ground levels. Using my camera flash as sort of improving flashlight, I could see that the stairs ended in a metal mesh door with a padlock. A sign on the door, a real sign, read, "Mascots only. Thank you." This perked up my spirits a bit, for 2 reasons. 1, a mascot-only area would have definitely have some interesting stuff back in the day. 2, the padlock was still in place. Nobody had gone down there. Not the vandals, not the looters, nobody. This was the one place I could actually explore and perhaps find something interesting to photograph or memento steal. I had come to the palace essentially agreeing with myself that it would be okay to take anything I wanted because hey, it was abandoned. It didn't take much to bust the lock. Well, actually, that's wrong. It didn't take much to bust the metal plate on the wall that the padlock was hooked to. Time and decay had done most of the work for me, and I was able to bend the metal plate enough to pull the screws out of the wall, something nobody else had apparently thought of or hadn't been able to do at the time. The mascots-only area was startling, and very welcome change from the rest of the building I've seen. For one, every second or third fluorescent light overhead was illuminating, even though they flickered and faded randomly. Also, nothing had been stolen or broken. Even the aged and exposed were definitely taking its toll. Tables had notepads and pens, and there were clocks. Even a punch-in clock on the wall, complete with filled time cards. Chairs were scattered around, and there was even a small break room with an old static-filled television and long rotted-out food and drink on the counters. It was like one of those old post-apocalypse movies. There, everything is left in a state of evacuation. As I walked the maze-like sub-basement hallways of the mascots-only area, the sights just became more and more interesting. As I went further, desks and tables were knocked over, papers scattered and almost melted on the damp floor, and the large carpet of mold was scrawling, overtaking the real rotting crimson floor covering. Everything was just sort of squishy. Anything wood disoriented into mush when I applied it the least amount of force, and clothing items hanging in hooks, and in one of the rooms simply fell into moist threads if I tried to unhook it. One thing that annoyed me was the light was becoming more sparse and unreliable as I furthered into the dark, suffocating depths of the place. Eventually, I reached the black and yellow strip door with the words "Character Prep 1" stenciled on it. The door wouldn't open at first. I figured this was probably where the costumes were kept, and I definitely wanted to photograph that twisted, sinking mess. Try as I might, whatever angle or trick I tried, the door just wouldn't budge. That is, until I gave up and started to walk away. That was when there was a slight popping sound, and the door cracked open slowly. Inside, the room was completely dark, pitch black. I used the camera flash to look for a light switch in the wall by the door, but there was nothing. As I made my search, I was jarred out of my senses of excitement by a loud electric buzz. Rows of lights overhead suddenly flashing to life, flickering and fading in and out like the rest I had passed. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, and it seemed like the lights were going to keep getting brighter until the bulbs exploded. But just when I thought it would reach the critical stage, the lights dimmed a bit and stayed. The room was exactly as I pictured it. Various Disney costumes hung on the walls, fully put together like strange cartoon canvases hanging on visible nooses. There was an entire lack of loincloths and native clothing on hangers towards the back. What I found odd, and what I wanted to photograph right away, was a Mickey Mouse costume at the center of the room. Unlike the other costumes, it was laying on the back of the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur in the costume was rotten and shedding, creating bare patches. What was even odder, however, that there was coloring of the costume. It was like a photo negative of an actual Mickey Mouse. Black where would be white, and white where should be black. His normal red overalls were light blue. The sight was off-putting enough that I actually put off photographing the thing until last. I took a picture of the costumes hanging on the walls. Upward angles, downward angles, side shots to show an entire row of frozen, putrid cartoon faces, some of the plastic eyes missing. Then I decided to stage a shot. Just one of the bed-ranged characters' heads on a stick, grimming floor. I reached for the headpiece of Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked in the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud shattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet, and there was my shoes. There, between my shoes, was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot's head and shattered into the pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and the lower jaw remained, staring up at me. I dropped the Donald Duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, I had to, for any number of reasons, and it seems silly, but only if you don't think it through thoroughly. I needed proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind, right from the start, that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, the photo negative opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet. The Mickey Mouse costume, or whatever it was inside of it, stood there at the center of the room. Its fake face was staring directly at me as it mumbled, "No," over and over, with shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart and legs that had once again turned into jelly. I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature, now quietly seizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of that thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey Mouse costume as the camera moved it unsteadily. As it moved it in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, mirroring the screen wherever Mickey's outline had moved to. Then the camera died, went blank, and quiet and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume.
Hey, wanna see my head come off?
It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy glove-clad fingers around its neck, with clawing, impatient movements, similar to a wounded man trying to pull himself free of a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits around its neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky yellow blood. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh. Only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone and fingernails. Abandoned by God. I never got the pictures out of my camera. I never wrote the blog entry about it. After I ran from that place, fled from my sanity, if not my very life. I knew why Disney didn't want anyone to know about this place. They didn't want anyone like me getting in. They didn't want anything like that getting out.